What if the most celebrated drink in human history wasn't a discovery, but a happy accident? Imagine early farmers cultivating their crops and stumbling upon a fermented surprise that would forever change civilization. Get ready to uncork the fascinating story of how wine might have truly begun. In the cradle of agriculture, stretching from the Caucasus through eastern Anatolia to Mesopotamia, early farmers were learning to tame wild grains and animals. Among the hills and river valleys around their new villages, wild grapevines climbed trees and scattered over rocky slopes. For these Neolithic communities, grapes were first just another seasonal fruit to be gathered and stored. Baskets filled with clusters were brought back to mud brick houses, where people experimented with drying, crushing, or simply piling the fruit into rough clay jars. Those new ceramic vessels changed everything. Unlike baskets or skins, clay jars could hold liquid for weeks, shielded from insects and dust. When grapes were crushed by their own weight, sweet juice pooled at the bottom, quietly waiting in the cool, shaded corners of early homes. No one needed to stir or add anything. Invisible yeast living on the grape skins began to feast on sugar, turning the juice cloudy and fizzy. To the villagers, it must have looked like the fruit had mysteriously come alive inside the jar. Imagine the first brave sip. Expecting ordinary juice, a farmer instead felt warmth in the chest and a pleasant lightness in the head. This strange new liquid tasted familiar, yet different, richer, sharper, somehow more powerful than the grapes it came from. Word of the special jar would have spread quickly through the village. Soon, people weren't just eating grapes, they were deliberately setting some aside, crushing them into vessels that seemed to magically transform fruit into a mood-changing drink shared at gatherings and rituals. Later myths would credit gods, heroes, or legendary patriarchs with inventing wine. But behind those stories lies a simpler scene: clay jars, wild grapes, and curious farmers in the Fertile Crescent discovering by accident that time and nature could turn fruit into something far more potent. To understand why this accident worked so well, we need to zoom in to the microscopic level. Grape skins are covered with wild yeasts, tiny single-celled fungi that drift through the air, land on fruit, and patiently wait for sugar in the right conditions. When grapes are crushed, those yeasts are suddenly bathed in sugary juice. In a mostly closed jar, oxygen quickly runs low, forcing the microbes to switch into fermentation mode. They begin transforming sugar into alcohol and carbon dioxide, releasing energy and heat as they multiply. Grapes are almost purpose-built for fermentation. They contain plenty of natural sugar, enough acid to keep harmful bacteria away, and just the right mix of nutrients to feed yeast. With no extra ingredients or equipment, a jar of crushed grapes can practically turn itself into wine. From the outside, the process must have seemed magical. The liquid frothed, hissed, and grew warm. Solid grape skins floated to the top in a thick cap, while clearer, darker juice formed underneath, a visible sign that the fruit was changing into something entirely new. As alcohol levels rose, the fermenting liquid gained another advantage. It became harder for many microbes to survive. Wine keeps longer than fresh juice, not because ancient people understood chemistry, but because they noticed that this fermented drink didn't spoil as quickly as water or milk. Of course, not every jar turned into perfect wine. Too much air invited vinegar-making bacteria. Too much heat could kill yeast. Over generations, people learned by trial and error, closing jars more tightly, choosing cooler cellars, and timing the harvest to nudge nature toward tasty, reliable results. What began as a spontaneous chemical reaction gradually became a controlled craft. Without equations or lab coats, early winemakers developed a practical understanding of fermentation, proof that you don't need modern science to do science. Careful observation, memory, and curiosity were their first tools. Thousands of years later, archaeologists followed the trail of this ancient drink by studying broken shards of pottery. Even when liquid is long gone, tiny chemical fingerprints stay behind, absorbed into the pores of clay and waiting patiently for modern instruments to reveal their story. In the hills of modern-day Georgia, at villages buried beneath layers of soil, researchers uncovered huge jars once sunk into house floors. Inside their fragments, they detected tartaric acid, the signature compound of grapes, hinting that these vessels once held large quantities of fermented grape drink. Farther south, in the Zagros Mountains of Iran, another Neolithic house hid a similar secret. A row of jars stood embedded in the kitchen floor, their interiors stained with crystals of ancient wine and traces of tree resin, perhaps an early attempt to seal and preserve the precious liquid. Meanwhile, in central China, archaeologists opened 3 otherworldly time capsules, slender jars from a lakeside village holding chemical traces of a mixed drink made from rice, honey, and fruit. It wasn't pure grape wine, but it showed that people on the other side of Asia were also experimenting with fermentation. Taken together, these sites suggest that wine and wine-like drinks weren't the invention of a single genius, but parallel discoveries. Wherever people had sugary plants, containers, and a little patience, they eventually stumbled upon the same secret. Nature loves to ferment. Yet the Caucasus and Near East hold a special place in this story. There, wild grapes grew in abundance, and early farmers eventually turned scattered vines into organized vineyards. Chemical evidence, grape pollen, and even ancient art all point to this region as the birthplace of true grape wine. What these silent jars reveal is simple but profound. Long before written recipes or wine labels, ordinary villagers were already making, storing, and sharing a drink powerful enough to leave its mark in clay for 8,000 years. For early communities, wine was more than a pleasant buzz. In a world without modern plumbing or germ theory, water sources could be risky. Lightly alcoholic drinks, by contrast, often stayed fresher and safer, turning wine into a reliable way to hydrate and get extra calories. A cup of wine carried the energy of the sun stored in ripe grapes, dense sugars transformed into fuel for the body. For farmers and laborers who spent long days in the fields, this liquid bread offered warmth, strength, and a brief escape from routine. But wine also moved into the realm of the sacred. Its ability to alter mood and perception made it a natural candidate for rituals. Sharing wine at funerals, harvest festivals, or temple ceremonies created a sense of connection, not just between people, but between humans in the invisible world of gods and ancestors. At the same time, access to wine could signal social status. In regions where grapes didn't grow easily, importing wine required resources and connections. A table laden with fine pottery and fragrant wine announced power just as clearly as jewelry, weapons, or palaces. Banquets where wine flowed freely became stages for politics. Leaders sealed alliances, rewarded loyalty, or displayed generosity as cups circulated. Who poured, who toasted whom, and who sat closest to the wine jar all carried meaning in the social choreography of the ancient world. Even beyond the elites, wine helped knit communities together. Shared jars at village gatherings, weddings, or seasonal feasts turned everyday drinkers into temporary equals, loosening tongues and encouraging storytelling, music, and dance, the glue that held oral cultures and collective memory in place. Seen this way, wine was never just a luxury drink. It was nutrition, medicine, social technology, and spiritual tool all at once. A versatile companion that helped early societies manage risk, celebrate life, and imagine their place in the universe. Once people realized this strange drink was repeatable, curiosity turned into deliberate experimentation. Instead of waiting for grapes to ferment by chance, farmers began choosing the sweetest vines, planting them closer to home, and watching which plots produced the most reliable harvests. Over generations, this quiet selection transformed wild, scraggly vines into domesticated grape varieties with larger, juicier fruit. What began as picking lucky plants in the forest evolved into managed vineyards, rows of trained vines that turned hillsides into carefully engineered landscapes. Winemaking tools followed the same path. Simple treading pits for crushing grapes became more sophisticated presses that could squeeze extra juice from skins. Fermentation moved from any spare jar to purpose-built vessels, some partially buried to keep temperatures stable throughout the process. In some regions, winemakers coated the insides of their jars with resin or wax, creating an early version of lining and flavoring. Elsewhere, they experimented with burying jars, stacking them in caves, or building stone cellars, each technique a small step toward mastering temperature and time. As production increased, storage and transport became new challenges. The invention of sturdy, two-handled amphorae allowed wine to travel by cart and ship, turning what once was a village specialty into a commodity that could fuel long-distance trade and diplomatic gifts. By the time early cities and kingdoms emerged, wine production demanded planning, organizing labor at harvest, allocating land to vineyards, and storing seasonal surpluses. Managing wine became a test of administrative skill, tightly linked to taxation, temple offerings, and royal banquets. What started as a lucky accident in a clay jar had within a few millennia become a full-fledged technology, a chain of decisions about plants, tools, architecture, storage, and trade. Wine was no longer just found, it was carefully engineered. From the hills of the Caucasus, wine's influence radiated outward. Traders, migrants, and conquerors carried grapevines and winemaking know-how across the Mediterranean, into Europe, North Africa, and beyond, weaving wine into the fabric of countless local cuisines and customs. Philosophers debated ideas over wine, poets praised it in verse, and religions folded it into their most sacred rituals. A drink first discovered by accident became a symbol of joy, sacrifice, hospitality, and sometimes excess, its meaning shifting with each culture that adopted it. In medieval Europe, monasteries kept viticulture alive through war, famine, and plague, refining techniques that still shape famous wine regions today. Centuries later, colonists and missionaries brought vines to the Americas, South Africa, and Australia, turning wine into a truly global phenomenon. Today, vineyards stretch from cool northern valleys to sun-baked southern slopes. Wine fuels tourism, agriculture, and luxury markets, but it also persists in humbler forms: shared carafes at neighborhood taverns, homemade batches in village cellars, and glasses raised at family tables around the world. Scientific tools now let us peer into wine's past and future with unprecedented detail, analyzing ancient residues, mapping grape DNA, and modeling how climate change might reshape vineyards. Yet the core mystery remains charmingly simple: crushed fruit waiting in a jar, transforming itself over time. Every sip links us back to those first farmers who noticed something unusual in their storage jars and chose to taste it rather than throw it away. They couldn't have imagined global wine industries or tasting notes, but they would recognize the familiar warmth that follows a good glass. In the end, the story of wine is the story of humans learning to collaborate with microbes, climate, and time. A single farming mistake blossomed into a tradition that spans continents and millennia, a reminder that some of our most enduring achievements begin not with grand plans, but with curious accidents.